today is sponsored by the Architectural Advisory Council. And I also want to give a special thanks to Cameron Campbell, Mark Young Serrano, who are doing our tech assistance here, recording the event. And I also want to thank Deborah Hoffman and the committee itself, made up of James Spiller, Patience Lewis, and Cal Lewis. This has been a bit of an effort here, but we're excited to get started this semester. If you haven't seen the poster or schedule yet for the spring semester, it will be coming soon. But I want you to pay special attention to this event and next week's event. This next week is going to be on Tuesday, not a Wednesday. Big difference, right? It's also not going to be in this room. It's going to be in the Howe Hall auditorium, the Alliance Auditorium, room 1140. And that will be at 6 o'clock, not 5:30. So please watch. Well, if for nothing else, look at the big banner in the atrium. That's your roadmap of that lecture. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jung Woo, and thank you very much, Jung Woo, for having this lecture here. And he's going to introduce the keynote speaker.
Okay, thank you for coming today to this special lecture. It's going to be my honor to introduce today's speaker, architect Doojin Hwang in Korea. He's a very active practitioner in Korea as well as I think in the world. Also, he's making many publications with using his own theories. So I believe this lecture is going to be a very unique opportunity to know his architectural world and think about your own architectural world. Okay. He studied architecture at Seoul National University in Korea and Yale University for his master's degree. And he has operated his own firm, architectural office, since 2000. He is interested in geometry, commonly found in his work. He has been concerned with the meaning of manipulating space, structure, and form in various geometrical orders. Even his HANOKS work, which is the traditional Korean house, which made his Korea unique, is an exploration of his the orthogonal grid order to post and lintel roof structure. He did his lecture tour actually 4 years ago in US, from Harvard to UCLA. And then this is his second chance for his lecture tour in US. But he did one lecture in Nebraska, U of Nebraska, and this is the second lecture in this period. And then he's going to do another lecture tomorrow, Kent State University, and then a few days later, Rhode Island School of Design. So here is Doojin Hwang. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And before I start my lecture, I have to thank College of Design for having invited me, and also for having made all the necessary arrangements so that I can talk to the student and the faculties well before my lecture. So thanks to that, I already see some familiar faces here and there. And my lecture is actually in two parts. The first part is about some overview of Asian history in modern and contemporary times, the way I see it, just to get you familiar with it. And the second part is about what I do as an architect within the context. This is what comes to my mind whenever I think of Asia. Yes, we still have communist countries, a few of them. And Asia is such a large region, so it covers many climate zones. And we have all 5 of major religions in the world. So some people have tried to find a common denominator in Asian experience. And some people think it's Buddhism. But I tend to disagree because that would rule out predominantly Islamic countries such as Malaysia and Indonesia. So in my mind, what binds most Asian countries together is this experience of colonization that took place in late 19th century and early 20th century. This map clearly shows the extent of colonization that took place in Asia. So, except for a very few countries such as Thailand or Japan, most Asian countries became colonies of European countries, America, and Japan. So in that sense, I would say the earlier part of the 20th century was the age of conflict and disgrace for Asia, and it still continues to be so in some ways. Let's look at this picture. I think Korea could be a showcase of this Asian phenomenon. This picture was supposedly drawn around the 1930s by a Korean painter called Bae Sung. This obviously is a family portrait of presumably quite rich family, ruling aristocratic family. The overall expression of the face is basically there is no expression. But if we look at carefully, we start to see little things, such as this man. He is looking at other direction. And this little boy here, I would call him the Korean version of Munch's Screaming Man. He looks very terrified. Look at this young lady over here. She looks a little amused and even optimistic. But I have to tell you, this is the end of this family as it has been before. By the time, Korea was already a Japanese colony, and the Pacific War, which this country was also involved, was only 5 years or so away. And we all know what happened after that. The Korean War that would eventually kill many in this picture and divide the country into 2. This really is the last portrait of the old Korea. The Korean War, which lasted for 3 years, 3 million people died, including many past members of this institution. I took this picture at Memorial Union. And we lost whatever industrial and social infrastructure we had, and then made both Koreas, South and North, the poorest countries in the world at the time. This is a quote from a very famous book which came out about a year ago, written by a British correspondent to Korea and a good friend of mine, Daniel Tudor. Basically what it says is that after the Korean War, we all became equals because of the devastation it brought to us. And then Korea entered a very rapid period of modernization. It was a 2-track process of democracy and industrialization. For the first time in the Korean history, the Koreans felt that they were no longer bound by the shackles of the pre-modern social class system. This rude awakening for individual freedom and equality was instrumental in motivating Koreans for a brighter future. And they worked hard for that goal. I mean, really, really hard. Therefore, I would say the Korean project of modernization was a revolution from bottom up. I just talked about this rude awakening for individual freedom and equality. Sounds a little familiar to you, don't you think? But nothing's free in this world, and we had to pay the price for it. And the price came in the form of discontinued history and tradition. Let's look at this picture. I took this picture in 1984. At the time, I was a college student studying architecture and also learning photography. I had gone to a high school over here, so that means this area was very familiar to me. Many of my classmates, my teachers, they lived in these traditional houses. 20 years after that, I was writing a book about Seoul. I wanted to write a chapter about this area. So I went back there, hoping to see this community more or less unchanged. But when I finally got to the point where I took this picture, this is what I saw. I'm talking 20 years. This clearly shows the intensity of modernization Korea went through. Well, let's look at other Asian countries. Well, I'm not here to sort of represent Asia. I'm here to represent myself. But as I said earlier, I mean, I'm saying all this because I want to get you familiar with what has happened in Asia in last century, so that you understand better the context in which I work. This is a very small town called Luang, Prabang in Laos. Laos still is a communist country, but these pictures seem to defy our very image of a communist country being very rigid and stern. And look at this. These are, elementary school kids. And look at the school building. I mean, it's like very traditional. And even the communist revolution didn't really take away their religious devoutness. The country still remains a Buddhist country, so you see a lot of these little shrines over here and there. It used to be a French colony, so there are still many colonial buildings dating from that period. And many of these buildings have been renovated into hotels and restaurants. But what I was more interested in was something like this. This is just ordinary cafe or restaurant. You can easily find in the street of Luang Prabang. But look at the level of craftsmanship, sense of color, and proportion. This, I believe, is not a work of a cultural elite. This is everyday ethics, everyday aesthetic. And I think this really shows the power of tradition. Thailand, probably the number one tourist destination in the entire Asia, is still a monarchy, just like Japan. They are basically an agricultural country, and they are proud of their background. As you can see here, this is probably the most expensive hotels in entire Asia, called Mandarin Oriental in Chiang Mai. And this is a bungalow type of hotel, and in between those bungalows, they still cultivate this rice field. And the visitors are welcome to join them. So they are not ashamed of their agricultural background, which I think is great. And this is the main building of the hotel. When I looked at it on the internet, I thought it was just a replica of an old building, clumsily built and poorly maintained. But when I actually went there to take a look, God, it was so well built, with a lot of high-level craftsmanship that went into it. And look at this building. Can you guess what kind of building this is? This, I believe, is probably the prettiest airport in the world. It's an airport in Sukhothai, which is a very old town in Thailand. And again, this is not a kitsch. This is very well built and well designed and well functioning building. So I guess again this really shows the tradition, the power of tradition. In China, especially at this moment, the traditional culture is coming back with a vengeance, especially after what they lost during the Cultural Revolution. They often come in the form of tourist attractions, such as this traditional swimming pool with traditional wooden structure roof on top. But increasingly, this Chinese long tradition comes in a much more critical work of architecture, such as this Ningbo History Museum by Wang, the recipient of the much coveted Pritzker Award in the year 2012. And finally, Japan. We all know about Japan. So far, the most popular iconic symbol of all that is Asia. But I should tell you that its cultural monopoly is coming to an end as more and more of the other Asian countries are being discovered. Please meet Geoffrey Bawa. This is an architect from Sri Lanka. He died in year 2003. He was probably the most well-known and well-published Asian architect other than those from Japan. As you can see in these pictures, he designed many predominantly vernacular style buildings, many of them very pleasant, as you see here. And sometimes he became very experimental, like this. I took this picture in year 2012 in Bangkok. We had a conference on the sustainable architecture in Asia. And this gentleman here is Mr. Mike Powell. He is a British man. He is an authority on tropical Asian architecture. And he explains what Geoffrey Bawa said about designing buildings in tropical weather. The reason why I was so interested in these things is, thanks to global warming, the weather system in my country, Korea, is changing. It's getting warmer and warmer. So I have started to call it tropical with winter. So I think I can learn a lot from what Geoffrey Bawa talked about designing a building in tropical weather. Having said all this, however, I seriously doubt the uniqueness of Asian regional culture is the dominating factor, especially when it comes to urban areas. If you had visited Asia about 100 years ago, these are the cities that you would have visited. You can easily tell one city from another because they all have very distinctive characteristics. But if you visit these cities now, and this is what you will see. Urban culture, no matter where you are in the world, basically has same set of problems, same set of issues, such as transportation, density, pollution, things like that. But I think this really is an international style in the bad sense of the word. Architectural writer Siegfried Giedion would have been horrified to see this. It is a global phenomenon from which there seems to be no easy escape. But it still makes us wonder whether this really is the only way. In this regard, I oppose to those soulless people, including architects, many of them from this country, who collectively mass-produce buildings like this all over the world without any sense of any sincere concerns or respect for history, culture, climate, and ways of life. I call this the Asian paradox. As Asia became more modernized, it started to ask more questions about the issue of cultural identity. And I see this as a healthy sign, though, because since we need to ask more questions to move ahead. Modernity versus cultural identity. So this wraps the first part of my lecture. I hope you have come to have some basic understanding about what it means to work as an architect in Asia these days. The second part of my lecture is exactly the story, and it's my story as well. I'm going to talk about 7 thematic encounters I had with my own country since I started to work as an independent architect, and also I'm going to talk about the related projects. This is my home as an architect. I am in the heart of historic center of Seoul. This is our main palace, which we no longer use. It's more than 600 years old. And this is our National Boulevard. And where these 2 red lines cross is where my office is. So you see, I'm really at the center of the old city. And within 1 kilometer diameter and 2 kilometer radius, I would say radius, there are more than 20 red dots, and these dots represent our past projects. So this clearly shows that the level of how much we are involved with our local community. And some people sometimes call me like the world's most local architect, and I welcome that nickname. The boundary of my neighborhood has vastly expanded now, but I think I will never forget where I started, because this is my Oak Park. Encounter number 1, urban heritage, alley system, alleyways. The picture here shows my own neighborhood. And the guy here is actually one of my staff. I've been waiting for somebody to show up, but there was nobody, so I called my office and asked one of the guys to come up and walk on the street. So I'm in a very old neighborhood, as you can see here. And sometimes those alleys can become very narrow, so that if you spread your arms, you can really touch both sides. And this particular alley is inhabited by people belonging to a certain religious sect. And they believe this is the center of the universe, not Ames, Iowa, but here. This was the very first building that I designed as an independent architect, and the location was superb. It was also in my own neighborhood. In the front, the street was quite nice and wide, but in the back, these are the alleys. And there are many alleys around here. So I had a choice between the 2. Whether to turn my back away from those alley system or somehow find a way to embrace them. And I chose the latter. As you see here, I created this internal corridor that runs through the building and also a courtyard in the back. And I connected them so that people walking on the street can literally walk through this building and enter this alley system behind. And also, we designed the staircase that doesn't go this way, but it runs straight up. And this was obviously inspired by a situation like this. I myself grew up in a community like this. Korea is a very mountainous country. More than 70% of its land is mountains and hills. So there are many hill communities like this. So I wanted to recreate this kind of situation in a new building. But whenever I show these two pictures to people, they often ask me whether I renovated this into that. But no, this is an existing community and this is a new building. But it clearly shows that I didn't turn my back away from the old urban heritage of my own society. And this is the overall view of the building. It obviously is a very contemporary building, but with the DNA of the architecture and urban systems from the past. Later, I had an opportunity to apply this idea into something quite different. About 5 years ago, 16 Korean architects were invited to have an exhibition in Frankfurt, Germany. They had this institution called German Architecture Museum, Deutsche Architektur Museum. And I was not only the participating architect, but I was also the designer of the exhibition. And what I did was to design the exhibition so that you don't really look at things on the wall. You walk through the exhibit as if you walk inside an alleyways. And also on one side of the wall, we have this large projection of the urban scape of Seoul so that you can really look out between through this alley system. This is in Berlin. We travel to 4 different cities in Europe. As you see here, we started from Frankfurt, then to Berlin, and Tallinn, Estonia, and Barcelona. And finally, we came back to Seoul to have our homecoming exhibition. So in this picture really resembles the real experience of being in an alley. Next, my second encounter was with architectural heritage, which we call HANOK. HANOK is a traditional Korean house. And even with Korean War and everything, there are very small area in Seoul which miraculously was saved from the bombing and rapid modernization. And if you ever come to visit Seoul, and this is the area you won't miss. One day, I got a call from a gentleman that I had known for years. He said, Mr. Hwang, I just bought an old house in this area, and I want you to renovate it for me. And then my initial response was, why me? Because I saw myself as a very typical contemporary architect and working on an old house like that. I never thought about it. But he kept asking me to do it, so in the end, I accepted the commission and we started to work on it. But in retrospect, as Professor Ji Jung-woo said, this is basically what makes my career very unique. That means we continue to work on these things even after the initial project. But in retrospect, I think if I had been born in countries like US or Japan or Europe, I didn't really have to work on projects like that. Because in those countries, the transition from traditional pre-modern architecture to modern architecture took place over a course of a very long time. Many architects were involved in that evolutionary process. So normally, generally speaking, outhouses became part of the interior space. And you add plumbing and all those modern appliances to that. So as a matter of fact, that process, that project became so successful in this country. So many of you live in houses like this. But that kind of process didn't take place in Korea. As you saw before, many of those houses were destroyed and just left the way they were. So probably I was at the right place at the right timing. So we started to work on these traditional houses without ever planning on it. So one by one, we renovated old houses. This was actually our second project. We thought the spatial flow within the house was not that good, so we converted this much area, we converted this much area into an open floor for better spatial flow and deeper spatial experience. And also this is a very traditional way of drawing architecture in Korea, so we tried that too. So we started to call this creative restoration. As this is the finished house. As you can tell, very high level of craftsmanship went into this house. Looks very traditional, but behind those doors and windows, closet doors, there are many machines that makes this house a completely wired building. So you can live a very contemporary life, even inside this very traditional looking house. So one by one, we started to get projects like that. And we also tried to do many experiments with new things. And this is one of the latest work. And in this house, we not only renovated all the structure, but we added underground parking and a basement living room, which is naturally ventilated and lit, so that a family of 4 can live there comfortably. So even today, this house is occupied by a family of 4 members, including 2 babies. And then we started to work on different programs. This is an Italian restaurant. We designed both the main building and the little annex, and the annex is being used as a group dining hall. So Italian cuisine in a traditional Korean building. This is not my work, but I should tell you that this is what inspired me at the time. And I should give a lot of credit to this country, because this is called Habib House, named after the United States ambassador to Korea at the time, who made a decision to build a Korean-style residence for the ambassador. So this is the US ambassador's residence in Seoul. The only US ambassador's residence overseas that is built in the regional style of the country. I had several chances to visit this building, and I was so much inspired by it because early 1970s, we didn't really think about using our traditional tectonics to house within it a very contemporary lifestyle. But this clearly showed to us that it could be done even on such a large scale. So with the inspirations from this house, I moved on to the next project, which became a lot bigger than what I had done before. This is a golf club house. Golf came to Korea in early 20th century. So that means that this quintessentially Western style sport had to wait 100 years to finally meet the Korean traditional architecture. So far, this is probably one of the largest HANOK owned by civilians in Korea, besides palaces and Buddhist temples. Then right now, we are just about to start wait for the groundbreaking ceremony for this 7-star hotel in one of the resort cities in Korea. The main building, the main building was designed by no less than Richard Meyer, and we were asked to design this traditional suite. But I believe that our involvement in working on traditional architecture has come to a full circle. And these days, I'm getting more and more interested in doing things like that. This is an entrance to a very traditional market, again, in my own community. And I wanted to try very different sense of proportion in this project. Normally, in typical Korean traditional tectonics, the proportion is too heavy. So I wanted to make it very thin because, we are all contemporary people. So what I did was I used a sandwich material. So between these two, there is a strip of metal that runs through the whole length of it to make it much lighter and proportionally much more acceptable by the contemporary standard. And I'm calling this evolution of tectonics. And this is the kind of work that I like to continue to do if I had a chance. But apart from this, most of what we do as an architects is very contemporary. And this brings us to encounter number 3. This time, it's a cultural heritage. We were asked to design a very old new building for a very old Oriental medical clinic building. Typical Oriental medical clinic in Korea is really a pre-modern institution. You go there and there is an old gentleman dressed in sort of traditional Korean way, and he writes something in sort of Chinese letters, which we contemporary Koreans do not really understand. So when they asked us to design new buildings for their clinic, we wanted to take a very different approach. So we carefully observed the way they run their operation and came up with sketches like this. A transparent building that houses machine-like structure that actually produces the herbal medicine. The Oriental medicine, you have herbal medicine on one hand and acupuncture on the other. And this particular clinic is more about herbal medicine. And then we show this 3D perspective to the client. He was silent for 3 days. So we thought that we lost the job. But on the first day, he called me up and said, Mr. Hwang, we thought we asked you to design a building for us. But what you proposed to us is not a building design, but a completely different way of operating our clinic. You enter the world of business planning. But I think that's the way to go. So he approved our approach. So we got this thing built. Again, in an alley area. So the centuries-old technique of producing herbal medicine has now become part of the urban streetscape. This is a very hard-working building, as you can see. These individual jars contain the amount of herbal medicine for one patient. After it makes one turn, it's ready. So it's extracted from the container and it's packaged in non-toxic plastic bags and delivered to your home. Everything's automatic. The building clearly demonstrates the way it is operated. And you can even actually go there and take a look at your own herbal medicine being produced. So everything's transparent. The process is no longer a secret. It's part of the society. So this is the model and this is the cross-section. We call this a clinic, but it's actually more like a small cultural center because the family has been running this for such a long time, about 170 years. So they have accumulated their own collection of artifacts related to medical practice. So we designed a small museum for them, and this is inside of that herbal medicine production area, and this is the patient waiting area, and this is the conference center in the basement of the building. So as you can tell, each story has different sense of materiality that reflects the spirit of Oriental medicine using natural ingredients only. So these different materials represent different materials for the herbal medicine as well. Next encounter was with the nature and ecology of Korea. Korea is in a temperate zone. That means we have very distinctive 4 seasons. The sun's very high during the summer and it's very low during the winter. And most of our traditional buildings have very long, deep roof overhang to control the sunlight according to different seasons. But since we are living in a very dense urban situation, the luxury of having very deep roof overhang is very hard to come by. So I had to find a way to accommodate that. Same problem, but different solution. So I came up with an idea of porous brick wall. And this is my very first sketch. We designed a simple, streamlined, minimalist building, 3-story tall. And this elevation happens to face the north. So it only has a very large windows. But on the side of this, on the other side, the building looks like that. This faces the south, surprisingly. So normally we would install large windows to have a view and for sunlight. But during the summer, the sunlight is extremely severe, so we had to block it. And also, as you can tell, this is again in an alley area. So there is a multi-family housing just in front of it. So if we put large window, then they will have some kind of serious privacy issues between 2 houses. So instead we did this. Looks very shocking during the day because it looks very solid. But in the evening, it looks like that. And from the inside, it doesn't look that solid either. And this is the north window, and this is the southern window. And this, in retrospect, is probably almost the same as this, which is also one of our earlier works. Again, same problem, different solutions. It really works. We took this picture in July when the sun was really intensely hot. And it blocked, as you can see here, it blocked most of the sunlight. But you can still see through. Well, we got very much interested in using this porous brick wall system in other type of buildings as well. So we recently finished this one. And we have just finished digging the ground for this 15-story building, which is entirely clad in brick. And its western facade is completely clad in porous brick wall system. We actually got so much interest in doing these things. So we have done a number of experiments with materials that have different type of porosity and translucency. We once even tried to create this concrete sponge. We are still looking for a chance to apply these ideas to real buildings. Encounter number 5, Metropolis. Seoul is a very large city with a population of more than 10 million. And as you see, so far I have been mostly involved in working in very congested area, in small alley areas. But with this project, for the first time I had a chance to work on, to think about large-scale issues such as transportation, public areas, and things like that. This was a pedestrian facilities for Han River. This is the Han River that separates the city of Seoul into two. This is the northern part, which is older, and this is southern part, which is much newer. It's only like 40 years old, but more than 6 million people are living there. So that really shows the speed of modernization that took place in my country. And this strip of land here is actually a floodplain. They are meant to be submerged once every few years. But during normal time, it's the largest single contiguous piece of public space in Korea, in Seoul. But the way to get there is not very public. You either have to drive there, well, there are many pedestrian tunnels, but whose location is not very well known unless you live so close. So the metropolitan government of Seoul wanted to, bring some changes to the situation, and they hired us to come up with a better way to make this public park more accessible. And this was what we did. Basically, what we did was we installed a bus stop in the middle of the bridge. And then we built this vertical circulation of elevator and staircase so that people can take bus to this point and come down to the riverside park, either by walking or by taking elevators. The elevators and stairs are large enough to accommodate bikers. And this video here is what we prepared for our presentation to the mayor of the city at the time. So he approved the design. So this is the section. And this is the picture that I took when the structure was being built. I like this picture because of this father and son on a bike. It's now quite popular among citizens. And at the time, we were also quite heavily involved in working on traditional buildings. So there was this sort of state of psychological division in our office. On one hand, we were working on contemporary structure. On the other, we were working on traditional project. But we never thought that we never had any traditional ideas when we worked on this. But only very recently, a good friend of mine, who is a landscape architect, told me that, Doojin, I think that project looks very traditional to me, in a sense that our ancestors used to build, small pavilions in beautiful nature. And that takes on the tradition. That's what he told me. I thought for a while, and I thought it was cool. So I decided to buy it. Like that. So, architects sometimes do that, retroactively. And this is the inside of the pavilion. The elevator literally goes into this pavilion so that you don't have to get wet. And it even became a site for a very experimental movie created by expats living in Seoul. Looks very futuristic. So encounter number 6 is Metropolis again, but this time about density and mixed use. I think cities need density to function properly, because density means shorter travel distance. That means less energy consumed. Again, mixed use is getting very, very important, because so I decided to call them rice cake buildings, because this actually shows the real rice cake. This is a traditional Korean rice cake with different layers with different colors. So I just wanted to give it a traditional Korean name. So this could be longer if you add more typical floors in between. And 3 days ago, I had a privilege of staying at this world-famous building designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in Bartlesville, Ohio. And they run a small hotel inside the building. And I was very happy to find that this building was originally designed as a mixed-use building as well. So Frank Lloyd Wright really was a pioneer in that regard as well. But given the context of Bartlesville being such a low-density community, whether this really makes sense from urban point of view or not, I don't know. It looks like very forlorn hero in a very low-density community. So I have my own version of mixed-use buildings. This is a rental office building, but on top of it is a private residence with small garden. And you can see it from the other side of the street for privacy reason. And it's in the middle of a very dense, very crowded area in Seoul. Finally, encounter number 7, and I like to call this synthesis, because everything I said earlier has come together to help me work on this project, which is so far the largest and to me the most significant work we have ever produced. Program-wise, this is a training facility for a professional volleyball team. Korea has a very small but very vibrant volleyball league. And the architectural theme of this project is layered geometry, a lesson that I learned from traditional Korean architecture again. I was deeply impressed by the fact that a variety of geometries, some based on orthogonal grid and some on much more expressive system, such as hyperbolic parabola, are integrated with a single building, within a single building, with harmony and excitement. I hope to continue that effort to create richness in geometric order, and the result was this building. From the outside, it looks like a very simple rectangular building, but in fact it is not. This is the very first sketch that I made, and we kept defining spaces using geometry as a guideline. From the beginning, I started with a 50 meter by 50 meter rectangle, and 50 meters is about 170 feet. So you know how you can judge the length of the building. You know, geometry itself has almost nothing to do with human behavior or the functions of the building. Therefore, the challenge of designing a building based on geometry is to strike a balance between a formal manipulation and programmatic requirements. And that's exactly what we try to do. And I like to call this an architect's game, something only we architects can do. So this model shows the various types of geometry. You can see a circle, you can see a square, and you can see orthogonal grid, and you can see the roof. Starting from the ground floor, again within 50 meter perimeter, this circle serves as a corridor, and the remains of it is in the shower. This is a shower stall. The wall is also curved. As we go up, this is what we have. Again, this circle becomes a running track for the volleyball players. Okay, you can see, start to see some of the elements of the orthogonal grid system that happens above. As in this is the dormitory level. On a larger scale, it looks like a very typical C-shaped atrium house. And you see diagonals here and there. They are cores. And on top of it is gently curved four foils of roof. This is a comparative analysis of geometry in this building with a traditional house. Again, this was one of our earlier works. And starting from basement to the roof, we made comparison between these two buildings. Obviously, this is much larger, but the geometrical principle is almost the same. You have orthogonal grid system, and you have diagonals and curved roof on both of these buildings. This project is in a rural area. As I told you earlier, I never had a chance to work in rural area because I'm basically an architect of the city. And since it's on a gently rolling hill, it was, for me, the closest thing imaginable to designing a building in the vast flatness of US Great Plains area. And it extracted very different architect out of me. Suddenly, fundamentals, such as the sun's direction, became very important. As you see here, the buildings rotated 45 degrees along these four cardinal axes, north, south, east, and west. There is a reason for that. In Korea, if you have layout like that, all four sides of the building will get sunlight, no matter what seasons around the year. It's a very simple design idea, but very effective. This is another model. We had to build this corner model because this geometry is so complicated. So in order to sort of make sure that this is going to work, we built this large-scale model in the process of designing it. This is a section, and I made comparison of this building to other famous historical buildings in other part of the world, such as Stockholm Public Library here, and Louis Kahn's Phillips Exeter Library. They are also very highly centralized buildings. This is the interior view. Again, this is the baseball court. So idea is you open your dormitory door and you are in the court. And this is the weight training area. And this is the running track. The building looks much better with players in it. Koreans are not, on the average, we are not very tall, but these people are extremely tall. Their average height is probably 6 feet, 6 inches, something like that. So we had to measure everything. Let me briefly talk about the material. Again, we were very much interested in using trying different type of material to control the sunlight and to keep the building from rain and snow, not perfectly, but to a certain degree. And in this particular building, we decided to use expanded aluminum panels. And they create very special kind of ambience within the building because light gets reflected and bounced back into the interior. So it's creating something like a rice paper effect. So as you can see this picture, as it gets darker and the light within the building gets turned on, the building starts to reveal its inner geometry, very complex geometry. So this is a staircase. It also works as a bookshelf for the offices and players' lounge. And you can see some of the training facilities as well. Okay, epilogue. I'd like to say a few words about fundamentals, which happens to be the main theme of the Venice Biennale this year, proposed by its head commissioner, the omnipresent Rem Koolhaas. I think one of the elements of the fundamentals is the building's ability to work with the nature in an environmentally friendly way. And we can still learn from traditional architecture, not because people in the past had a higher sense of environmental mission than we have, but simply because there were not enough resources and energy, so they had to find a way to come up with a way to work with what little they had. I think as creators, we should start from somewhere. It doesn't really matter where you start from. and especially now on this increasingly flat earth, where we are infinitely connected with one another, I think it's perfectly okay to be locally inspired as long as we are globally connected. And finally, 4 things that I keep in my mind whenever I work on a project. First, work with nature. Second, learn from tradition. But that's not just enough. Since we belong to this time in history, we have to be very critical about what we do. Therefore, I suggest we should be experimental and we should live our time. I hope this will bring us a new, more refined, and more culturally and environmentally sensitive version of modernism in Asia and of course beyond. This wraps up my story. So thank you for listening, but before I go, here is one final question for you. What is your story? Thank you.